When the Coast Guard called me just after midnight asking why my boat, the Lucky Escape, was 5 miles offshore with a dozen drunk people dancing on the deck, I honestly thought someone was messing with me. I sat up in bed, still foggy from jet lag after a week-long work trip to Seattle, and said, "I'm sorry, what?" The officer's voice was calm but firm. "Sir, your registered vessel was just boarded. There are no life vests on board, alcohol is being served without a license, and no one present has a boating permit. We need you at the marina immediately." I pulled on jeans, grabbed my keys, and felt my heart slam against my ribs. That boat was mine. I'd locked her down before leaving. She was secured at my private slip behind a coated gate. No one should have been able to touch her. When I arrived at the marina, the Lucky Escape was tied to the dock, red and blue lights flashing across her white hull. Officers were questioning a group of partygoers in cocktail dresses and polo shirts, all strangers to me. Then I saw her, standing stiff with her arms crossed, platinum blonde bob glowing under the deck lights. Olivia Cartwright. HOA president of Windward Palms. Mid-50s, eternally sour expression, and self-appointed ruler of our waterfront community. I walked up and said, "That's my boat. Frederick Taylor. I didn't authorize any of this." One officer lifted an eyebrow. "You know her?" he asked, nodding toward Olivia, who suddenly found the dock very interesting. "She's the head of our HOA," I said. "So what the hell is going on?" The officer exhaled and tapped a clipboard. "They claim they had permission. Said the HOA controls dock properties and can approve recreational use for community events." I just stared at him. "That's completely false." Olivia finally approached, lips pinched like she'd bitten into a lemon. "Frederick," she said, voice coated in fake concern, "we needed a venue for the Windward Summer Gala. The clubhouse renovations weren't finished, and your boat was, the most suitable. You weren't using it. You broke into it," I said. She flicked her manicured hand. "Technically, the association has access rights to shared dock resources." I laughed. "That dock isn't shared. It's deeded to my property. You know that." Her tone hardened. "Perhaps that's something the association should revisit." "You're being unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" I stepped closer. "You trespassed, hosted a party with massive liability, and dragged the Coast Guard into this." She shot back, "None of this would have happened if your boat were fully compliant." The officer stepped between us. "Ma'am, you're not helping yourself." For the first time, Olivia looked shaken. Another officer whispered to the lead investigator, who turned to me. "Mr. Taylor, we'll need an official statement. If you'd like to press charges for unauthorized use of your vessel, now is the time." I looked at Olivia. Her jaw was tight, eyes darting, searching for an exit that wasn't there. "I'm pressing charges," I said. "And I'm not stopping there." By morning, I'd spoken with a maritime lawyer, filed a police report for grand theft, and turned over footage from a motion-activated dock camera I'd installed 6 months earlier. The video showed Olivia unlocking the gate with a master key she had no legal right to carry, waving in a catering crew, and directing them onto the Lucky Escape like she owned it. It also caught her slipping what looked like envelopes to 2 guests, one of them the HOA treasurer, Douglas Wright. That wasn't just trespassing. That was conspiracy. Detective Mara Clean from County Property Crimes met me later that day. Calm voice, sharp edges, the sound of someone who dealt with enough HOA drama to recognize a real problem. "Mr. Taylor," she said, clicking her pen, "we confirmed the deed lines. That dock is entirely yours. The association has zero authority over it or your vessel. Based on the footage and the Coast Guard report, we're preparing charges for unlawful entry, misuse of private property, and potential insurance fraud." "Insurance fraud?" I asked. She tapped her notes. "You mentioned a security system on board. Did it alert you?" "It's tied to my home Wi-Fi." I disabled notifications while traveling to avoid roaming fees. She leaned in. Because the system was manually powered down from inside the cabin. That's deliberate. And if your boat suffered damage, which it did, then they're liable. And if any claims are made without disclosing unauthorized use, that's fraud. I took a slow breath. So what happens now? We're serving a warrant at the HOA office. If our suspicions are right, she didn't act alone. This was planned. By the time I got home, word had spread. Linda, a neighbor 3 doors down, waved me over. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said quietly, glancing up the street. "I overheard Olivia talking to Douglas last week. She mentioned putting your boat to community use and said no one would care if it was just one night. I didn't think much of it then. Would you be willing to say that officially?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. If it helps." "It helps a lot." As I handed her Detective Clean's contact info, a white Nissan with the HOA logo crept past my house. The driver was Janice, Olivia's loyal enforcer, the same woman who once cited me for an improperly angled American flag during a windstorm. She locked eyes with me and drove on. The intimidation was weak, but expected. That night, I went through the HOA bylaws line by line. I'd ignored them for years, like most people. Paid my dues, kept my head down. This time, I read every clause carefully. And there it was. Appendix D, Section 9. No board member may use privately owned property for community purposes without written consent, regardless of proximity or perceived benefit. Violation is grounds for immediate removal pending a quorum vote. I wasn't just pressing charges. I was ending her tenure. The next morning, I called for a special HOA meeting. 10% of residents were required. I had 20 signatures by noon. Olivia wasn't universally loved. People tolerated her for neat lawns and stocked coffee machines. But once they learned she'd hijacked a neighbor's boat for a private party, even the fence-sitters were done. By late afternoon, a county patrol car sat outside the HOA office. Detective Clean and another officer walked out with a file box and a laptop. Olivia was gone. She'd left town that morning for a so-called wellness retreat in Arizona. Coward. The investigation continued anyway. Emails were recovered between Olivia and Douglas discussing creative use of idle resident assets and how to frame the event to limit liability. In one message, Douglas asked, "What if he finds out?" Olivia replied, "We call it a misunderstanding. He's reasonable." I printed that email. The emergency meeting was set for Saturday night at the community center. By then, whispers had turned into anger. Residents found leftover party trash in their bins. Cleanup crews had been told to scatter the waste so it couldn't be traced. When I walked into the hall, it was packed. Chairs filled every space, people lined the walls with arms crossed. Douglas sat near the front, pale and sweating. He'd already been questioned that morning. And he knew exactly how close the walls were getting. I stepped up to the podium, unrolled the petition, and laid it flat in front of the secretary. My name is Frederick Taylor. I am the lawful owner of 14 Windward Bay and the private dock connected to it. As of Tuesday night, that property was illegally accessed by members of this board and used without my consent for a private gathering. I filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff and submitted evidence supporting every claim. A low murmur spread through the room. I raised a printed email from Olivia. This came directly from the HOA server. It shows intent. There was no confusion, no mistake. The murmurs shifted into sharp gasps. A man in the back blurted out, "She used our dues for this?" "Yes," I said, "and it gets worse. The bylaws are explicit. Section 9 of Appendix D states that any board member who uses private property without permission is subject to immediate removal. I've met the petition threshold. I'm calling for a vote. Douglas tried to interrupt, but the secretary and Ruth, an older board member who'd served for years, shut him down. We'll vote now, individually. It took 20 minutes. When it ended, the numbers weren't close. 64 voted for removal, 2 against, 3 abstained. Ruth stood and addressed the room. By majority vote, Olivia Cartwright is removed as president of the Windward Palms Residential Association, effective immediately. Any further leadership role is suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Applause erupted through the hall. Someone yelled, "About time," and the clapping grew louder. I didn't react. I gathered my papers and walked into the night, the cool salt air brushing my face like a reset. Olivia hadn't faced everything yet, but the fractures were there, and I wasn't finished widening them. 2 days after the emergency meeting, I was called back to the precinct, not by Detective Clean, but by a federal investigator from the Department of Homeland Security. That caught my attention. I went in expecting to clarify details about the boat. Instead, I was handed a much larger problem. Agent Rafael Mendoza met me in a quiet conference room, sleeves rolled, lean build, sharp eyes that took in everything. We've been tracking irregular activity tied to several coastal properties, he said, sliding a folder across the table. Your HOA and its president flagged our system last month. I opened it. Inside were bank records, association ledgers, and a scanned guest manifest from the night of the party. At the bottom, 2 names were circled in red. I don't recognize them, I said. You wouldn't, Mendoza replied. They're aliases linked to an interstate wire fraud ring. We believe Olivia was laundering money through a shell nonprofit she registered as the Windward Coastal Enrichment Fund. I stared. You're saying the HOA was a front? Not entirely. Most residents had no idea, but Cartwright and at least 3 others used association accounts to route money from fake community projects, dock repairs, clubhouse expansions, landscaping, and redirected it into offshore trusts. I leaned back, stunned. And the party? A cover, Mendoza said. It was used to host 2 out-of-state buyers looking to acquire waterfront property using forged deeds. The boat was chosen because it was neutral. No known surveillance. No obvious paper trail. They didn't know about my dock cameras, I said quietly. Mendoza gave a thin nod. That footage fast-tracked our warrant. I looked up. What happens now? Douglas Wright has been detained. He tried to fly to Panama yesterday. The other 2 involved board members, Janice Leland and Peter Menn, have been subpoenaed. Olivia is still missing and not in Arizona. The retreat was a lie. We traced her phone to a private airstrip near Charleston. She's traveling on a passport tied to a fabricated identity. Once she crosses certain borders, extradition gets messy. I exhaled. How much did they take? Just under $3 million over 6 years, mostly through inflated invoices and fake grant projects. Small upgrades and strict rule enforcement kept homeowners quiet. People stopped asking questions. I nodded slowly. Until she picked the wrong boat. Mendoza cracked his knuckles. We're working with the Attorney General. A federal complaint will be filed by week's end. Until then, we need your cooperation. You'll have it. That night, I came home to find a crowd near the marina gate. Someone had taped a printed news article to the HOA board. Local HOA president under federal investigation for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Under it, someone had written in marker, "So much for the summer gala." I recognized neighbors, Linda from down the street, the Danilos, even Mr. Roth, a retired firefighter who once said he stayed out of politics. Now he held a clipboard. We're forming a transitional committee, he said. Until the state appoints an administrator. Thought you'd want to join. I hesitated. I'm already drowning in legal work. This isn't about paperwork, he said. It's about taking our neighborhood back. You were the first to stand up. That counts. I looked around. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were people who'd been deceived and sidelined, and now they were ready to clean house. Fine, I said, but I'm not touching landscaping. A few laughs broke the tension that had gripped Windward Palms for too long. 2 mornings later, I testified before a grand jury in a windowless federal courtroom, answering questions about the boat, the HOA finances, and the emails Detective Clean uncovered. The prosecutor, Marissa Duval, zeroed in on the Shell nonprofit. Did you ever receive communication from the Windward Coastal Enrichment Fund? No. I'd never heard of it. Did you authorize any use of your dock or vessel for association events? Never. She nodded. Jurors wrote quietly. Afterward, Mendoza met me outside. She's finished, he said. Not just theft. We're adding impersonation of a federal grant coordinator. She forged a letter to secure a state subsidy for coastal education. Let me guess, I said. There were no programs. None. Just a fake website and stock photos. I shook my head. He sighed. I've seen rogue HOA presidents before, but never one laundering money through a boat party. By week's end, Douglas flipped. In his plea deal, he admitted to years of fake invoices, including a non-existent seawall inspection that earned them $50,000 in a single afternoon. In exchange, he gave up everything: offshore contacts, Olivia's alias, even the notary who backdated forged signatures. That cracked the case open. The state froze HOA accounts. Contractors were blacklisted. Windward Palms was placed under court conservatorship, and a forensic accountant began unraveling the mess. The Lucky Escape sat in dry dock for repairs. The Coast Guard cleared her, but restoring the damage would take weeks. Someone had drilled into the hull for a champagne cooler. Another flushed plastic cups down the head and burst a pipe. I paid out of pocket, knowing I'd be reimbursed, but money no longer mattered. This wasn't about repayment. It was about making sure the next person who thought power meant entitlement thought twice. One evening, while reviewing documents for a civil suit, my phone rang. It was Mendoza. We got her. Where? Grenada. She had been attempting to board a yacht registered under a shell company. The Coast Guard intercepted it. They said she'd be extradited within the week. I didn't respond right away, just sat there staring at the wall of my study. After a moment, I asked, was she alone? The answer came quickly. No. Her notary was with her. And a man we believe helped falsify the property deeds. I thanked him and ended the call. The next neighborhood meeting took place under the new transitional committee. The catered spreads and inflated speeches were gone. Instead, there were folding chairs, notepads, and honest conversation. Near the end, I stood up. We have a lot to rebuild, I said. Not only docks and budgets, but trust, accountability, and community. We let one person turn this place into a personal empire because it felt easier not to question anything. That stops now. When I finished, no one applauded. They simply nodded. That felt right. Approval comes easily. Agreement requires effort. And after everything we'd endured, the people of Windward Palms were finally ready to put in that effort. On a quiet Wednesday morning, I walked into the county courthouse with a folder under my arm labeled WPR Association Civil Action. The courtroom was smaller than I imagined, windowless, with wood-paneled walls humming beneath the dull buzz of fluorescent lights. At the front sat Judge Harlan Whitford, his expression suggesting he'd already read more HOA nonsense than any judge should in a lifetime. Douglas Wright sat beside his attorney at the defense table, thinner than I remembered, hands clasped tightly in his lap. His suit didn't quite fit, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. The other 2 former board members, Janice and Peter, appeared by video from their detention facilities, their faces boxed into the corner of a wall-mounted screen. Olivia's chair was empty. Her extradition had been delayed 2 days due to a diplomatic technicality, but the judge ruled the case would proceed without her. My attorney, Tanya Riley, a sharp former JAG officer, stood and began the opening statement. We intended to prove that the Windward Palms Residential Association, under the leadership of these individuals, knowingly exploited private property, misused homeowner funds, and violated fiduciary duties for personal gain. We would also show that Mr. Taylor suffered material losses and reputational damage as a result. Judge Whitford didn't react. He simply wrote something on a yellow legal pad and motioned for the first witness. We began with the marina's dock manager, who confirmed the association had no legal access to my slip or vessel. Then came the forensic accountant, who outlined a brutal timeline of money trails, inflated invoices, kickbacks disguised as community grants, and contractor payments funneled through a Nevada LLC with no staff or equipment. But it wasn't until Linda took the stand that the case shifted from scandal to something far darker. They told us the clubhouse project was over budget, she said, her hands shaking slightly. They said we had to approve an emergency dues increase, but I never saw any permits filed. And when I asked about the contractor, I was told it was handled internally. Tanya asked her to explain. Did handled internally mean the board oversaw the work themselves? No. Linda said it meant the contractor was Olivia's nephew. He didn't even live in the state. He owned a landscaping business in Utah. She'd looked it up. The gallery murmured. Judge Whitford struck his gavel once. Tanya thanked Linda and called the next witness, Rachel, a former HOA assistant barely out of college who had quit 6 months earlier. They made me create fake meeting minutes, Rachel said, her voice quiet but steady. Sometimes I was handed a list of decisions and told to write them as if the community had voted. I didn't know it was illegal at first. I was told it was normal for private associations. The judge leaned forward. Had she ever seen signatures forged? Rachel nodded. For times, she saw Olivia sign names of members who were out of town. Olivia joked that if they didn't show up, they didn't get a voice. That afternoon, Tanya called me to the stand. What was your first sign that something was wrong? She asked. The call from the Coast Guard, I said. I'd just returned from Seattle. They told me my boat had been used illegally by people I didn't know for a party I never approved. She walked me through the footage, the damage, the repair estimates. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting. In my opinion, was this a one-time error, a simple misunderstanding? No. I said it was deliberate. They knew I was out of town. They accessed a locked dock, tampered with my equipment, and used my vessel to entertain buyers involved in a fraudulent real estate deal. That wasn't confusion. That was organized theft. The defense attorney, a gray-haired man who looked like he'd wandered in from a golf course, stood for cross-examination. Wouldn't I agree the HOA regularly hosted community events? Yes. And weren't those sometimes held in shared spaces? My dock wasn't shared. He argued maps had been filed. Those maps came after the bylaws. The deed was clear. The judge cleared his throat. Counselor, the property lines have been verified by 3 independent records. Let's move on. The attorney sat down, deflated. Tanya nodded as I stepped away. The next day, the courtroom was packed with reporters. News of the HOA scandal had spread statewide, and the phrase "dock gate" was now trending on local radio. The prosecution introduced new evidence, a USB drive taken from Olivia's laptop. It held dozens of audio recordings, voice memos she'd apparently kept from meetings. Maybe for protection, or maybe because she was arrogant enough to think she was untouchable. One recording silenced the room. Olivia's distorted voice said, "If we get pushback, we say it was sanctioned. If he sues, we bury him in court until he quits. Homeowners don't have the stomach for legal drama." Judge Whitford stopped the playback and peered over his glasses. Had the recording been authenticated? Yes, Tanya said. The metadata matched the seized laptop already admitted into evidence. By week's end, the civil case had exploded into a full federal prosecution. Olivia now faced charges including wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and falsification of legal documents. The judge ordered immediate asset freezes on all 3 board members. Bank accounts, vehicles, and secondary properties were seized under RICO statutes. Douglas's plea deal was revoked when investigators uncovered a second undisclosed shell company. On the final day, the judge issued summary judgment for the plaintiffs, myself and several homeowners who had joined the suit. The HOA was dissolved by court order. Its remaining assets were placed into a restitution fund to repay residents defrauded over the years. My boat repairs were covered in full, plus damages. But the real victory was structural. The county issued a new oversight mandate for all coastal residential associations, requiring financial disclosures, annual audits, and rotating third-party compliance officers. Windward Palms would no longer be a private theft. It would be a neighborhood again. Outside the courthouse, I stood with Tanya as the news vans packed up. She asked if I'd ever imagined something like this happening. Honestly, I said I expected a warning about my trash can being out too long. Not a federal racketeering case. She laughed softly and thanked me for pulling her into it. She said she'd be telling this story for years. A few weeks later, I hosted a small get-together. Not a gala, not a fundraiser, just a barbecue with neighbors. No speeches, no motions, just people who had survived something together, finally breathing freely. Mr. Roth brought ribs. Linda made her lemon bars. Even the Danilos, who had once planned to move, stayed late, their kids running barefoot across the lawn. As the sun dropped over the bay, I walked down the dock and stepped onto the Lucky Escape. Her deck was spotless, the repairs flawless. She looked better than she had in years. I sat at the helm, engine quiet, and let the stillness settle in. No more forced compliance. No more threats sealed in envelopes. No more strangers treating my property like their own. Just water, wind, and the sound of a neighborhood beginning to heal. Justice had taken its time, but it had finally arrived.